I am delighted to be able to introduce my friend and brilliant scholar, Marissa Baradaran. She is an associate professor of law at the University of Georgia, where she was recently named Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives. Professor Baradaran's research focuses on banking law. Her first book, How the Other Half Banks, has received national and international media coverage, and she is now a staunch advocate for postal banking as a way to bring financial services to underserved communities. Professor Baradaran was born in Iran and immigrated to the United States with her family in 1986, and this has inspired her to write very eloquently about the situation of political refugees in the United States and other refugees. She earned her bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and her law degree from New York University. Before teaching at the University of Georgia, she was a professor of law here at Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School, where she was a founding member of the A-Lot flag football team with me and several of our other friends and colleagues here. And we are just so grateful to hear from her today. Her second book, The Color of Money, Black Banking and the Racial Wealth Gap, is the topic of today's lecture. We're excited to have her here as a way to celebrate Black History Month and learn much more about history. We'd like to welcome her.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back in Provo. I remember Jessica as coach, and I remember the first practice for our flag football team, Coach Priest shows up with a bunch of plays and, you know, gives us all positions, and it became apparent very quickly that we needed some help with the basics, like running with a ball, catching a ball, and understanding which position, like where you had to run, and so it was a steep learning curve, and I don't know if we ever actually executed the plays necessarily, but and we didn't win any games that season, but we had a lot of fun, and I think it's gotten better now, but it was one of my favorite parts of being here at professor here. Okay, so I am going to talk about my book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And basically, it's a history of American politics through the lens of black banking. And one of the things that I was hoping to uncover here, actually the project starts when I'm at my office at BYU Law, and I'm doing all this research in, you know, credit unions and savings and thrifts. I am a banking scholar. I spent some time working as a banking regulatory attorney on Wall Street after law school, and got interested in banking regulation, and my first couple of projects were on, you know, various different banking forms. And I was at BYU Law School, and I wanted to read about, I stumbled in this history of all these black-owned banks. And I'm like, oh, what is this sector? And I need to know more about it. So I asked the librarian to find me the books on black-owned banks. And there was nothing. And we looked all over this library and that library. And so it immediately started working on it. So this is a project that started about 8 years ago. And I wrote that other book and finished it before I could come back to do this history. And as I started writing this history on black banks, it became not a story of banking, but a story of the racial wealth gap. And the numbers are quite stark. Today, the racial wealth gap is one of the biggest, I think, this is the place where sort of racial injustice in the past breeds present inequality. So with or without college degrees, there's this wealth chasm. And this is a chasm, and I focus on wealth specifically, because wealth bleeds into a lot of other sectors where income doesn't. This is something that has not changed over time. So the share of the wealth owned by the black community in 1865, the dawn of emancipation, is 0.5%. I mean, this makes sense, right? Slaves weren't allowed to own property. Free blacks also had property restrictions. 0.5% of the nation's wealth was owned by blacks. Today, that number hovers around 1 to 1.5%. There is not that much movement here. And so this book actually tries to shine light on why that is and how the racial wealth gap was created, perpetuated, and what has been done to try to fix it. And black banking has been the community's tangible way of fighting this racial wealth gap and growing wealth. Because banks, after all, are wealth producers. As Alexander Hamilton noted early on in fighting for the national bank, banks are where silver and gold or money acquire life. Banks create wealth. And we'll talk about that, how that is. But black banking, it's built on this myth that you see a lot in banking policy. And this is a myth that is embraced by the right and the left. So it's not a politically charged myth, but it's one that I am trying to bust in both of my books. And the idea here is that poor, disenfranchised communities can bank their way out of poverty through sort of small community banking. And I blame here Thomas Jefferson and George Bailey for this myth. Thomas Jefferson, unlike Alexander Hamilton understood that we would be an industrial nation, that we would need a strong, powerful banking sector. Thomas Jefferson was terrified of banks. He said they're more dangerous than standing armies because they're too powerful. Okay, so he wanted banks to be local and small, and that's how we would enhance democracy. Now, he was right to be fearful of the big, powerful banks, because actually Jefferson's nightmare is what we're living today, 5 big banks that control 80% of the country. But he also thought that small banking would, sort of increase access to credit. And then there's George Bailey, of course, that was sort of immortalized in It's a Wonderful Life. And increasingly, my students don't know this movie, so we all know this movie, right? Okay, because I'm going to come back to it. Yeah. So George Bailey is the mythical community banker that is very interested in helping his community. And so the foundational theory here is the premise that, a community, let's say the black community here, having been left out of the dominant banking industry through law and policy, will pool its resources and collectively lift itself out of poverty. And this theory, in one form or another, has been championed by various black leaders, starting with emancipation until today. And today we talk about it with words like microcredit, community empowerment, community enterprise, et cetera. And there's been various moments in time where the charge to bank black has been invigorated. And recently, just last year, there's been more of a push to bank black. This was in Atlanta as an event with Killer Mike and Usher, asking the black community to take their money out of the white-owned banks and put them in black banks. And so the idea stemmed from a protest, right? So there's a couple of threads here in this sector, because there's both this wealth enhancing function that banks serve, but there's also a racial uplift and protest function. But as I show through the book, and I'll explain in a little bit, the same forces that create the need for black banks, such as financial disenfranchisement, segregation, and poverty, are the very same forces that impede their growth and their ability to live up to their promises. In other words, racism and housing segregation present tangible and observable economic effects on the black population that you can actually follow through these balance sheets, which I'll go to in a little bit, but also that these banks have always been bigger and more than just their balance sheets. These banks have represented community cohesion and empowerment through the long struggle toward civil rights. And the history of black-owned banks is certainly not uniform, and it starts off with a bang, right? So the Freedmen's Savings Bank is the first quote-unquote black bank, but it's not technically a black bank. It is created by Congress during the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau is the Reconstruction effort after the South is defeated in the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau is created by President Lincoln to help ease freed slaves into the populace, right? A lot of the promises of Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau are built on land, right? The 40 acres and a mule. The idea being that not only has the South created treason in sort of fighting the Union, but also, you know, the slaves had worked the land for hundreds of years, that they should get a share of the land. Now that is subverted violently in the South. And what emerges from it, the only thing that survives President Andrew Johnson's veto is the Freedmen's Savings Bank. And the idea is, look, instead of land, you'll get a savings account. And it will be just as good, because you will save your way toward land, and that's better, that's more sort of egalitarian, okay? So what the bank does is that it creates 35 branches, and it's immediately embraced by the freed slaves. There's $1.5 billion in today's money in deposits that immediately come to the bank. Why? Because at the time that the Freedmen's Bank is created in 1865, we don't have a national currency yet, right? Lincoln had just issued the greenback, okay? Before that, bank notes were our currency. So there's gold and silver, but the bank notes were what you used to trade with, and the bank note was worth exactly how the bank itself, was built on the reputation of the bank. So in other words, if JP Morgan was going to issue you a note from his bank, that would be worth more than a note from, you know, random Provo Bank, you know, that is not backed up by JP Morgan. So the notes of the Freedmen's Bank are, they have the United States flag on them, they've got Lincoln and Grant, and it looks to be, because it was created by Congress, signed by President Lincoln, it looks to be backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government. And so these deposits come in, and the thinking goes, this is in the time before FDIC insurance, okay? So you had to trust a bank with your money, and the trust here was enabled by this idea that the bank was going to be backed by the Treasury. It wasn't. Okay, and the leader, the manager of the bank was this guy, Henry Cook, who's brothers with Jay Cook. And Jay Cook is an infamous railroad bond speculator. He is this, you know, investment banker of the day who invests in very speculative ventures, which the railroad bonds were the most speculative at the time. So he takes this money that is deposited by the free slaves and speculates it away into the railroad bonds. And that there's a financial crisis that wipes out the deposits of the freed slaves. So they lost about half of the deposits in this bank. And at the time, that was it. There's no way to get it back. There's no insurance. There was no Treasury backing. So this is not a great start for these freed slaves. And remember, I mean, this was during the era of sharecropping, so these wages were hard-won wages. So the failure of the Freedmen's Bank really significantly affects the community. W.E. Du Bois says of the failure, not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the Freedmen's Bank, which was chartered by the nation for their special aid. This was a bank that was meant to help us, and he says not even 10 years of slavery more could have done more damage. So this failure reverberates, and black communities no longer trust the federal government. You wouldn't either. Not only do they not trust the government, there's a suspicion of banking. They move internally, and I'll talk about the banks that emerge afterwards. But there's also something else that happens after this bank. After the propaganda that the bank uses to bring in these deposits, this idea that a bank account is the way toward wealth, which is true, right? This is back to Hamilton. Black communities across the country are inspired to create their own banks. As the bank is failing, Henry Cook and Jay Cook bring in Frederick Douglass, who is the most prominent black leader, right, abolitionist of the era, and he becomes the last president of the bank as it's failing. He comes into the bank as president, and he gives 10% of his, a $10,000 loan to the bank of his own money. And as soon as he gives the loan, he understands, he says that he understood that the bank was full of dead men's bones, right? That this is a failing bank. And so he tells Congress to pull the charter, and he tells people to stop putting their money in the bank. But he also, as he reflects on the bank years later, he says, I could not help reflecting on the contrast between Frederick the slave boy and Frederick the president of a bank, counting its asset in millions. I had heard of golden dreams, but such dreams had no comparison to reality. So understanding that the bank failed, he was struck, he says, he would walk by the grand building in Washington, D.C. and look through the windows, and he saw black tellers counting money, right? So, this is from slavery to becoming bank clerks. This was a huge infusion of dignity and respect. And so the failure of the bank, its creation isn't this uniform story of failure. There's also this sense that we can do this too, right? We can manage books, and we can have our own banks. So this is what happens after the Freedmen's Bank. In the turn of the century, communities all over the South, black communities, this is heavy Jim Crow, heavy segregation, and they have to turn inwards for all of their needs. And so what happens is there's a lot of churches, black churches, that step into the void as white institutions are not allowing blacks to integrate with whites. Black churches form fraternal societies, mutual aid societies, burial societies, right? Funeral homes refuse to bury blacks, and so black burial societies are the way to, service this need, and banks. Okay, so the early banks, starting after the Freedmen's Bank until the 1910 era, are these banks that are linked with churches. Okay, so one emblematic example, since it's Black History Month, I'll tell you about one of the most inspiring figures in black banking is this woman, Maggie Walker. Maggie Walker is a daughter of a slave, grows up very poor. She's a brilliant student. She becomes a teacher, and when she gets married, she's forced to quit teaching because married women couldn't teach at the time. And she joins the St. Luke's order, this is her church, and starts a bunch of different organizations tied to her church. So she starts an insurance fund just to help the members, insurance, printing press, college education fund, and then she starts the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. And the idea is that she's just going to help people with their money. She gives cardboard boxes to kids to help them save. She says, we'll turn our nickels into dollars through banking. Maggie Walker is an incredibly successful banker. She is the first female banker in American history. Not just first female black banker, but the first woman to start her own bank. And is such a successful banker that she's initiated the first African American to be initiated into the Virginia Bankers Association. And her bank is one of the only black banks that survives the Great Depression because she's very, very conservative. She helps, because her bank is so prominent and good, she helps a bunch of other banks survive through a merger during the Great Depression. Another example, since it's Black History Month, this is the first black millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker, not Maggie Walker, Madam C.J. Walker. She is the first black millionaire in Harlem, sells hair products. Anyway, back to the story. So during this era, a lot of these banks are formed across the country, and a lot of them still exist in the South. These are tied in with these other community organizations. And then there's this demographic shift. Starting in 1910, 6 million black migrants, this is called the Great Migration, move from the South up into the North and to the West into these cities. And they're running away, but they're also being pulled by the North. They're running away from boll weevil that's killing cotton. They're running away from the racial hostility of the South and the Jim Crow era violence and the Klan. And they're running toward the industrial North with its promise of jobs and progress and wealth. And as they come north, they are met with heavy housing segregation. Okay, so welcome to Harlem, welcome to New York, please proceed to Harlem and stay put, right? But there's also a lot of vibrant communities formed during this time, right? There's a Harlem Renaissance in Chicago, lots of Black cultural sort of synergies that happen as you have concentrated Black communities. This is also the golden era of Black banking, as you have concentrated communities of wage earners all over the North and the West. You've got Black banks that are emerged to fill this need. One of the most famous is Jesse Binga. He's a Chicago banker. Another really interesting person who's been lost to history. Jesse Binga is a really prominent real estate developer, and starts buying up properties in the South Sides, redeveloping them and selling them. Very wealthy guy. He buys a house near the white community, a nice fancy house, and it's bombed 15 times, because at the time, Blacks were not supposed to live in the neighborhood. And he refuses to move. And every time the cops are like, why don't you just leave so you can stop getting bombed? And he's like, it is my right as an American citizen to live where I want. And so he exercises that right and is a leader here. His bank is quite successful, but it fails during the Great Depression. But it's this tragic failure. All the banks of the era are failing, but Jesse Binga's fails, and he is the only banker during the Great Depression that is prosecuted and put in prison for his bank's failure. As you know, during the recent financial crisis, bankers don't go to prison, right? That is just like, rule number one. I was a banking attorney, I understand this, right? There's always ways to get around the rules because your bank failure isn't usually your fault. But Jesse Binga was prosecuted, put in prison wrongfully, is brought out of prison by Clarence Darrow, who's a famous attorney at the time, but it takes 10 years, and Clarence Darrow finally gets him out. But by the time that he's out, he's in ill health, his wife has left him, and he's sort of broke. But so it was not easy to be a banker at the time. But I'm going to come back to this era, because if there was ever an era where Black banking, this idea that segregated communities could build wealth was going to work, it was during this era. And this is the era in the book where I go through their balance sheets and show exactly how they were working or not working. Okay, so the Great Depression decimates the Black banking industry. Only 8 or so survive. And then we have the New Deal. And the New Deal is a complete rewriting of the American economy, but specifically the banking sector. And whereas before the New Deal, we've got bank failures every several years. People are losing their money left and right. After the New Deal, we have a federal government infrastructure on which banks can rely, and we don't have bank runs anymore, right? We have FDIC insurance. We've got the Federal Reserve liquidity provisions. And we've got this redesigning of the economy with heavy state intervention through the FHA and the GI bills. And the FHA, what the FHA does is it frees up private capital into the mortgage sector. Okay, so before 1934, if you wanted to get a mortgage, you had to have 50% down payment. It was like a 5 to 6 year mortgage. After the FHA, you get a 30-year amortized mortgage. Very low interest, very standard product. And the reason is because the FHA is this big pot of insurance money that protects banks against default. So banks very willingly and readily lend. Only problem with the FHA, so this creates the American middle class. This is when Levittown is created, all sorts of American suburbs rely on the FHA. People are able to pay less now for a mortgage than they were paying for rent, and so they move into the suburbs, they create great schools and bowling alleys, and this is the great America that we sort of immortalize from the post-war boom also sort of feeds into this. The problem with the FHA is that they cut up the country in maps. And this is not a problem, it was actually just trying to mitigate risk. But what happens is that the HOLC before the FHA tries to figure out which mortgages are safe to protect and which mortgages aren't. Okay? And so they create these maps all around the country, very detailed maps. And if you look at the green and the blue, those are low-risk areas where the FHA will insure. And the yellow is medium risk, the red they will not insure, okay? And banks just follow these maps, and so they will lend into the green and blue and somewhat to the yellow, but they won't lend to the red. And the thing that the FHA uses, the main predictor of what is red and yellow and green, is the racial makeup of the neighborhood. So green and blue are racially homogeneous, which was white. Yellow is, you've got Jews and Italians and other sort of undesirable neighbors. Red was black areas, okay? Specifically, I mean, they weren't looking at credit ratings, they weren't looking at income, although those are certainly correlated. They were looking at race. In fact, you have these weird things happening where the FHA is telling communities that they're too close to the black area. So there's this one place in St. Louis where the white area was too close to the black area, and so the white area was being denied FHA mortgages. So they just built a concrete wall, like a 5-foot concrete wall, and then they got to have the mortgages, okay? So this creates the black ghetto and the white suburb. It was government intervention. Now the government isn't a bunch of, Ku Klux Klan members, right? They weren't trying to be racist. It's just the water that we swam in, and it was reflective of the market. The market at the time is that people preferred not to have black neighbors, okay? So they were just reflecting market reality, okay? But what they did was they created a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? But this is post New Deal. This becomes this is the era where you have the golden era for American banking, right? The credit union, the savings and loan, George Bailey's building and loan. There are hundreds of thousands of community banks created in this time, selling that FHA mortgage. So the reason why George Bailey is able to provide those loans to the community, I mean, obviously George Bailey's not real, but like based on reality, is through the FHA mortgage. So buildings and loans and savings and loans and credit unions are able to give voluminous sort of mortgage lending and student lending. And the black communities, only 5 black banks are formed during this time. It's not easy to be a black banker. One of the black banks that's formed during this time is Jackie Robinson's bank in Harlem. And that's an interesting story that maybe I'll talk about later. But he's really an inspirational a banker who had a really tough time with his bank. And he talks about it. The reason why Jackie Robinson starts the bank is he's saying, we've got all of these vets coming home, these black veterans, and they can't get the GI Bill and they can't get the FHA loans. No one's lending to them, so I'm gonna do it. But because he doesn't have these infrastructures, his bank continues to struggle and really, really struggles. Okay, so then you have the resurgent, the civil rights push in the 1960s. And the leaders of the civil rights movement understand that this economic disparity is crucially important. So Martin Luther King, before the I Have a Dream speech, before Selma, 1953, he creates a 10-point plan. So Rosa Parks gets on a bus in 1955. Before Rosa Parks gets on a bus, Martin Luther King lays out the plan for the black economy, the civil rights movement. And he has a 10-point plan. And number 1, 2, and 3 are, we need to form black banks, we need to form black credit unions, we need to have economic power, and then like number 6 is voting. Okay, so the impetus, and if you remember, the bus boycott is a boycott, it's an economic boycott of buses, right? And the march toward, the march on Washington was a march for jobs and freedom. Okay, so it's very much, economic justice was very much part of Martin Luther King's mission. If you read the I Have a Dream speech and go past the part that we tend to focus on is, I want my kids to not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, there's a whole other section in there that talks about, we have come to cash a bad check. It has been marked insufficient funds. He is using the language of economic redress, and he says that, economic redress. Now, Coretta Scott King was a bank teller in Atlanta at a black bank, and so his whole mission is laced with this ideology of banking. But not just Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is very clear on this, but so is Malcolm X, right? The other sort of strand, the Black Power strand of the movement, and that's a different era, right? He's talking about Black nationalism. And so he responds, why should white people be running the banks in our community? We need our own banks. So there's two different strands happening, but both are pushing Black banks. So I said Martin Luther King, his first speech is about banks. This is his last speech before he gets assassinated. It's his I have been to the mountaintop speech. It's a tragic speech because he sort of, kind of foresees that the mission is over. But before he does that, he says, we've got to strengthen Black institutions. I call upon you to take your money out of the banks downtown and deposit your money in the Tri-State Bank. We want a bank-in movement, right? So he is very much focused on this. And so we tend to write this civil rights story and think, okay, so 1964 is a Civil Rights Act, 1965 is a Voting Rights Act, done, right? Fait accompli. And what happens afterwards is really shocking to people. Maybe not shocking to those who lived through it, maybe here, but what happens is this urban crisis, it's called, right? The day after the Voting Rights Act, Watts, LA, erupts in violence. You've got Detroit, Newark, all over the country in the north, right? We've been focusing on the south and the Selma and Birmingham. In the north, you've got this violence that erupts, and people are confused. Johnson is like, I don't understand what's going on, right? But what's happened is this bifurcated credit market that has become oppressive and onerous that the civil rights laws don't quite address. So one of the things, and this is the story that is not told about the civil rights era that I try to tell in the book, but Congress sort of meets to talk about what drove the urban crisis. And what's happened is that remember the red line maps? Okay, so I'm gonna go back there. Not only is determinant of mortgages, but there's also a consumer angle to this. The FHA is also underscoring consumer loans. And it's not as strong of government intervention as the housing market was, but it allows for a diminished risk of consumer lending in the white suburbs. So you have your mortgage, and because of the lower risk and the wealth that you've built up, you can also get a credit card. A credit card relies on revolving credit. And what this means is a credit card issuer can sell that risk into a secondary market. What that means for individuals is if you can get a credit card, you can use it flexibly in any store, and you can pay interest that is lower. And the reason the interest is lower because the risk is spread out. And in the Black ghetto, we don't have credit cards. What develops there for credit is this thing called installment credit. And it's night and day. So outside the ghetto, we've got a market that's subsidized by the federal government. Inside the ghetto, you've got market prices for credit. And it turns out market prices for credit are steep. Okay, so what does this mean, right? If you want to buy a refrigerator, you pay $300 for the fridge. It ends up costing you $1,000, okay, because it's based on installment credit. So, and if you miss a payment, the repo man comes, the cops come, and they take the refrigerator away. And there's this movement that runs alongside the civil rights movement that recognizes this, right? They're saying these lenders are exploiting us. They understand that they're paying more for basic necessities. And so Congress meets to talk about the urban crisis, okay? And they say, they come up with three different things that are happening. One is, and the FTC studies this guy David Kaplowitz writes this book, it's called The Poor Pay More, and they look at these things and they're saying, indeed, it costs more to pay for everything. Food, housing, groceries, I said food, appliances, all of that stuff in the ghetto than it does in the other areas. So they come up with three different things that come out of the riots. One is that the rioters are targeting the lenders. Okay? They're going specifically, and they're saying things like burn the books, get the books, forget the stuff, get the books. The books were the means of oppression as they saw it, right? This was exploitation. And so for the rioters, it was very much, it wasn't that they were white lenders, right? It was that they were exploitative lenders, or so they said. So they thought. The second one that people just hang on, and the policy outcome relies on this second finding, and this is sort of Jacob Javits of New York. He says the rioters are leaving alone what he calls soul brother establishments, so black businesses, right? So the thing that they hang on is, oh, it's the whiteness of the lender. That's the problem. If we just had more black lenders, that somehow they would not have such exorbitant costs. The third outcome, and this is the one that everybody ignores, but it's clear in the findings and in the congressional reports, is that these lenders are not profitable. Okay? They're not actually exploiting people. They're not racist. It just costs more to lend because it's higher risk. Okay? So the policy outcome of throwing more black lenders into this economy ends up becoming a disaster, okay? But that's what the outcome is. So there's a lot that is happening during this time, and the 1968 election is sort of this pivotal move in our civil rights era. And so we've got on the left, this is the election I think that changes America, and I think we're still sort of seeing the output. On the right, you've got George Romney, who is from Michigan, who understands very well this racial problem. To hear George Romney talk about race is incredibly inspiring. He understands the mechanics of this economy. He says, this is George Romney's words, he says, the white suburb is like a noose around the black ghetto. Okay? He says, if we don't integrate, or if we don't actually infuse capital into these communities, this problem is never going to be fixed. This is George Romney. Now, he gets pushed out because he has this gaffe that talks about the Vietnam War and doesn't get to run. Then you have Barry Goldwater, of course, who's Southern Strategy. There's George Wallace on the right. There's also Nelson Rockefeller, who is friends with Jackie Robinson, very much a pro-civil rights Republican. Those guys don't win. Nixon wins. And I'll get back to Nixon in a second. On the left, you've got Robert Kennedy, who also very much, a reformer. Gene McCarthy, whose stance is just anti-Vietnam, and then there's Hubert Humphrey, who's mixed up with the Johnson administration, and the Johnson administration is probably the most corrupt presidential administration in American history. And they, although he gets a lot done, and he gets a lot done because he knows which strings to pull because he was, a corrupt senator for a long time. So Johnson leaves office. Humphrey loses, and Nixon understands that the way forward, so the Republican Party sort of splits along George Romney, Rockefeller versus the George Wallace, Goldwater, and Nixon is in this middle ground, and he chooses the Southern strategy, which means he has to halt any forward motion on civil rights, okay? So he decides that but he has to have a plan on civil rights, okay? Because it's 1968 and there's a lot of demand. There's this Black Power movement that's gaining traction, and there's a lot of, liberal Republicans, or I guess reformist Republicans, who want him to move. And so he decides to co-opt the language of the Black Power movement and talk about we need more black ownership, black pride, black jobs, black opportunity, black capitalism. And this is his strategy. And I'll talk about this in a second. So this is advertisement before, oops, hold on, get to Reagan in a second.
Richard Nixon speaks on black capitalism. It's no longer enough that white-owned enterprises employ a greater number of Negroes, whether as laborers or middle management personnel. This is needed, but it has to be accompanied by an expansion of black ownership, of black capitalism. We need more black employers, more black businesses. Integration must come, but in order for it to come on a sound and equal basis, the black community has to be built from within, even as the old barriers between black and white are dismantled from without. We have to get private enterprise into the ghetto, but at the same time, we have to get the people of the ghetto into private enterprise as workers, as managers, as owners. These past few years have been a long night of the American spirit. It's time we let in the sun. It's time to move past the old civil rights and to bridge the gap between freedom and dignity, between promise and fulfillment.
The proceedings pre-recorded political announcements will stay for our Nixon Action Committee.
Okay, so one of the most fun things I did in this research is to go into the Nixon archives in Yorba Linda. I would recommend going if you're interested in history. And everyone focuses on Watergate, right? There's like all these boxes that are, cataloged that everyone's looking at. And I went in to look at the campaign literature. And there's all of these memos back and forth between Nixon and his advisors, one of whom is Alan Greenspan, and others, Milton Friedman, who are telling him that he cannot push integration. He cannot push any sort of capital, right, reparations or anything like that, because it's anti-capitalism, and the populace just won't have it. So this speech, his Black Capitalism platform, goes through a variety of different iterations. And the earlier forms of this, so see that place where it says it's time to move past the old civil rights? In the first 6 or 8 drafts of it, it said, forget civil rights, right? And then, you see the advisors come in and cross out forget and put move beyond, and so they finagle this language until it's time to move past the old civil rights. But the message was the same: no forward motion on civil rights. Okay, this is the Black Capitalism framework. He basically decides to create an Office of Minority of Business Enterprise, the OMBE, creates this Black Capitalism framework that ends up becoming just celebrating, Horatio Alger stories, putting some Black businessmen on the cover of magazines. Affirmative action comes out of the Nixon White House. These sort of contract set-asides to Black firms that then the Supreme Court, says is reverse racism. But it's weak, but it is very successful. It is the path out of civil rights for a political party, actually for a population, because I'll talk about how the left also is very much complicit in this, who doesn't want to push forward on economic justice. In the meantime, George Romney is a HUD secretary. Okay? And George Romney is the last stand here in the Nixon administration. So George Romney is in HUD, and before Johnson again, master of the Senate, corrupt as heck, but very effective policymaker, is trying to push, so he's got the Civil Rights Act, then he's got the Voting Rights Act, and he understands that he needs a housing act, right? Because of all these red lines and the way that the housing has been split up by race, he puts together the Fair Housing Act. The way he does it, he knows that it can't pass, right? After someone says in 1966, you couldn't pass the Emancipation Proclamation in this Congress, right? It is not friendly to any civil rights legislation. The way Johnson gets this law passed is he waits until, he doesn't know it's happening, but as soon as Martin Luther King is assassinated, the nation's in shock. 2 days later, he gets this bill passed, right? Takes advantage of the nation's shock. And what the Fair Housing Act says is that the Congress should affirmatively further, right, anti-segregation or fair housing, okay? And Romney takes this on as like a missionary. It's like, okay, my job is to affirmatively further integration. So he's in there in the Nixon White House and is a thorn on Nixon's side. He keeps putting forward all these plans. He does this one in Warren, Michigan. It's called Open Communities, where he's going to have build fair housing near a white community. The idea being we're going to integrate schools, right? Because property taxes fund schools, and if you've got no property owners in a Black ghetto, and then the schools are different, right? So Romney's idea is like, we just need to integrate, right? And so we're going to create these different programs. And he goes to Warren, and there's a white riot. And George Wallace says, looks like Romney figured out that the North is just as racist as the South, okay? And in the administration, these are the memos that are just heartbreaking. You hear Romney, Romney keeps writing Nixon saying, look, it's like he's explaining to him that this is the right thing to do. Assuming that that's the reason Nixon isn't doing it is because he doesn't understand. But Nixon understands very, very well that he cannot push integration, okay? And so every time Romney comes up with a plan with very good reasons, look, if we just do this, then all these injustices will be fixed, and Nixon will put on the top of the memo, stop this one, right? Call him Mr. Integrationist, right? He wants to label Romney as Mr. Integrationist to get him out. He tries to get him to be ambassador of Mexico. He tries to get him to resign several times. Romney finally does resign, and he writes his letter to Nixon. He's like, working with you has been an instruction in how politics works. I appreciate that. I mean, it's this very polite letter, but you can feel the sarcasm in there, right? Thank you for showing me how politics works. But once Romney's gone, that's it for affirmatively further housing integration. We have not had a HUD, left or right, any administration that's really pushed forward the plans that George Romney was considering. And the reason is because black capitalism is so successful. So you've got President Reagan, he talks about minority business development is the key to economic progress. Black-owned businesses are important in neighborhoods and economies where the dollars have a beneficial multiplier effect. And I'll talk about this. But this is the theory, right? If you can keep money in a community, it will grow in that community. Okay? And the plank is that a free economy will defeat discrimination by fostering opportunity for all. So if we deregulate and let capitalism fix the problems that the government created, it will do it. Okay? But again, it wasn't capitalism that created the ghetto. It was the government. And then you have Bill Clinton, who really takes this charge, right? So he talks about this as community empowerment. So this is Clinton's take on this. I told you I would hit both. And this is Clinton on. Let me pause here. So Shore Bank is a black-owned bank in Chicago, in South Chicago. Muhammad Yunus, who is a Grameen Bank founder, comes to the Shore Bank before he launches Grameen International, and is really, is it 1150? Okay. Okay, so I will wrap this up really quickly. This is with Clinton talking.
When you look at how effective is it and how much is it spread?
First, it is almost universally effective where it's done based on the same model that he and the other big governments in Bangladesh used. That is where you realize you're going to give the people.
Anyway, just to forward, he says it works, right? Microcredit, so he launches this program of putting small banks in these communities, CDFI fund. Obama also, businesses in black communities, this is the civil rights plank that survives. And then you have Donald Trump, who deems October to be Minority Business Enterprise Month. And so this is the story of black capitalism that remains, and the story that I've tried to tell in the book. So I guess I have to end. Thank you.